Hello, hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to another episode. I honestly don't know if these are called episodes, stream. I don't
Either
know what to
works,
call
I
them.
guess.
Yeah, I don't know what to call them. Well, thanks for showing up today, everyone, for
Absolutely.
Teach Jenn Tech. And welcome, Leo. I just did like some weird Anyway, it's a Tuesday. Yesterday was a holiday. Today's my Monday, and I'm feeling it. Welcome to the show, Leo. See if I can actually talk. And please introduce yourself and what you're currently working on and what you're going to teach us.
Absolutely. So yes, my name is Leo. I'm currently by day a software engineer at a startup called Copy AI. We do a bunch of really cool stuff with like GPT and text generation. And then on the side, I've got a number of fun little projects. The current product I'm currently building out is who should I unfollow to identify dormant Twitter accounts that you follow.
Oh, that's cool.
It is incredibly useful, and it's something I built out of frustration because I follow a lot of people, and I kept hitting the 5,000 person limit that you can follow. And so I'd have to go through and unfollow kind of one at a time. And I was like, this should be easier. So I made it easier over the course of like
Yay.
3 months because, it's never quite as
Okay.
easy as all of that to actually build a product. But yeah, it's been fun. And then I've got a Twitter CRM that I've been building out now for over a year. And actually part of this is rebuilding that. But and then I do a number of things. Got a podcast, getting into the streaming realm. And so that kind of brings us to today's topic of data models. And so one of the things I find very, very helpful in creating any sort of system, whether it's like a full like application that I'm building or just basic automations, I like to identify the data I need and kind of build out models. And that helps me understand how that data moves through systems. And so once you have a good understanding of that, the design of the systems kind of really come into focus pretty well. So I figured this would be a great opportunity to kind of dig into a scheduling thing I've been working on and kind of looking at how to allow people to kind of come inbound and schedule either streams or recordings and kind of how we can do some of that modeling. So I think that'd be a fun topic for today. So let's do it.
Yes. And really quick, because you did mention quite a few, and I think it would be cool because you talked about the podcast and what you're going to be starting streaming. Please fill us in on that too, because I'm like,
yeah, absolutely.
There's so much knowledge drops that we got to make sure we got them all.
That's kind of the hard part. So it is. So the podcast is called How to Scale Yourself.
Okay.
And I'm in the second season right now. And it's all just like conversations with people who are scaling various aspects of themselves, kind of using the internet. Talked to several entrepreneurs, talked to our mutual friend Lobau. He was actually my first guest because, he's awesome and just, but yeah, I see so many people doing really cool things online. And mostly I started the podcast because I just wanted to talk to some of them and see what people are doing and like just have conversations. And so that's what it's about. And it's actually like I'm really focused on like having it just be raw conversations. Like I don't put a ton of effort into like editing. It's really just about the conversation because I think one of the biggest issues right now that we have is all of the content that's being put out online is extremely polished because you're having to compete on kind of these like external qualities, right? As opposed to the actual meat of the podcast, right? Or whatever we're doing. And so that's one of my ways to kind of fight back against that. And then with the streaming, that's actually part of a thing I'm doing called Build in Public University, which is really all about like capturing kind of those unique essences, being raw and unfiltered, and then kind of building out shared media platforms that we can use to kind of share people's stories and help them get to kind of that baseline of quality so they can focus on sharing what matters. And in this case, really their story and why they're doing what they're doing and kind of the most important aspects of that, as opposed to, trying to compete in the realm of like SEO and, fighting the algorithm for distribution. yeah, I think we're just doing a lot of things the wrong way, and so this is my effort to start doing things the right way and actually, focus on the stuff that matters. So that's all of that in a
Yay.
nutshell, and it is fun. I just have a lot of fun doing it, and so yeah.
I feel like I'm going to be asking you about a ton of that stuff later on because just scalability.
It's actually what I'm really good at. I'm really good at the whole scaling thing because I just build systems that can help me scale.
God.
And so that's how I manage kind of doing a whole bunch of different things. I build out systems that can support that because I think that's really the most important thing that we can do, because we can achieve all sorts of things, but we need to have those systems in place or it's really easy to burn out.
Yeah, and I mentioned that because I have the oh yay, thank you for saying hi. We got a hello.
Excellent.
And it's definitely something that I found that I'm like, if I just do the project itself, I have time for all of these projects. But it's the social media. It's the social media.
Yeah.
I say it like that because I have my podcast, Shit You Don't Want to Talk About. So when you talk about unfiltered topics, I'm like, yes, please, give me more. Love them. And then I have Teach Jenn Tech. Okay, cool. This one, at least, is somewhat like easier because it's all live stream. I just have to make the graphics and tag people. So that one is easier. But like the Denver API meetup, I'm like, now I have to think like someone else to be able to post stuff. And then now I'm consulting with Gravity and being able to do more of that type of content and also be myself tying them all together.
Right.
And I'm like, so scalability, that is something that I will.
Scalability. And that actually kind of comes back to the data models, because one of the key aspects to being able to scale is to having data models that effectively scale. And so what you'll find with a lot of like just kind of clumsily designed systems, as you start to scale, the data models fall apart. They don't work well together. You end up with, like as you start scaling, you have to start thinking about things like, okay, what happens if the same data comes in multiple times, right? Like, how do we handle that? And so kind of figuring out how to like identify the data that matters and then organize it in a way that does effectively scale, because otherwise you're going to be fighting the system more than it's helping you, right? And that's kind of the balance. And I have been known to build systems like, oh, I did this thing once, like I'll just build this giant system now. And that's not a great way to do it, but it is a good way to get experience doing it. So it's that catch-22.
Yeah. And I would say that like something that like I realized before our stream, like I get what data models are, but I don't get what data models are. Like it's very like abstract, yet at the same time, I'm like, it's another one of those that it makes total sense, yet doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So could you define for us what a data model is?
So a data model in its simplest terms is a representation of something in the real world. And I mean, I say real world, and actually that doesn't even need to technically be true. But the idea with a data model is essentially a model is a representation of something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the data model is the collection of attributes that you care about for that object. So, you could have a very simple data model that is simply like an ID to determine which one of these things, right? Like if you have a collection of marbles, like, okay, well, I've got 400 marbles. How do I identify one from the other? Okay, we'll throw a numeric ID on it, right? So they're just numbered. You can count them.
Okay.
Now, obviously, that's an incredibly simple example and not particularly useful. But one of the models that I think is really important that is also very difficult is kind of a person, right? And I say this because it's really interesting to think about how different social media platforms model people, and more importantly, how they model those relationships. And so this is something I focused a lot on. And So, you think of a person on Twitter, for example, since I know we're both active there. What is that like? What does that look like, right? And so you've got kind of their display name. You've got their username. You have their profile picture, their header image, their bio, right? And so as you start adding in these different pieces, you start to get this more complete picture of what this person is. And one of the trickiest things with data modeling is if it's not in the data model, it doesn't exist. And typically, like, you think of a person and then you start trying to associate that with a Twitter profile. The natural inclination is to just assume a lot of things about the person, right? Like, but in terms of like the system, if it's not there, it doesn't exist. And so that's the toughest part with kind of creating these models, is you want to determine what needs to exist to make the system function effectively. And it gets trickier too when you start thinking about how systems interact, because so like as I build out, for example, a CRM, and I've got the idea of a person, right? And I want to get some of that information from Twitter. And so there's Twitter's idea of a person, and then there's my object, or my data model of a person. And so as I'm building out these models, one of the things I like to look at are kind of how do we transform like a Twitter person into like a Feather person. Into Feather's my CRM that I'm building. So we need to figure out kind of like what parts of that model Twitter has, what parts I have, and then where I can get kind of the data that I don't have yet. And so kind of the way I view this is, if you're familiar kind of with graphs here, and I'm a big fan of a concept called a directed acyclic graph, which sounds horribly complicated, but it's really not terribly. It does. But if you think of a graph, it's essentially just a collection of nodes and lines. And so circles and lines connected, that's in very basic terms a graph. But a directed acyclic graph has two unique properties. So it's each connection between two nodes can go in a specific direction. So that's the directed part of it, right? Like, so from node A to node B. And for me, this is a lot of like system A to system B, right? So it's going from Twitter to Feather.
Right.
And so, okay, we understand that connection exists. And then the other part of it is actually acyclic. So there are no cycles. So it's like, I don't look at it in terms of going from like Twitter to Feather and back to Twitter. I look at it as going from like Twitter to Feather, and then there's a different graph that would be like Feather to Twitter. Like, so what this really maps out then is it kind of, it's a really good way of mapping the flow of data through time. And I did a lot of this when I was working as like a data engineer in healthcare. We're getting all of these data sources in from different places. We had to combine them. They go through this pipeline that like does various transformations, reporting, and everything. And so the benefit of kind of modeling it in this directed acyclic graph is, you have kind of these like well-defined steps that the data goes through, right? And so it's like, okay, so I get the first step is like, I get the data from Twitter. Okay, cool. Now I've got this data. And then the next step is like, okay, I transform this data into the format that Feather is expecting. And then, from there, it's like, okay, well, now I know that I'm missing this piece of data, so I can go to this external API to pull that, right? And so then I combine that with the data. And then finally, like, I pass it on to Feather. And so, you can see these very, like, distinct steps. And it's actually a really good way to just understand how data moves through systems and kind of these different steps. And so that's kind of the flow of data.
Quick question, just
Yes.
because like something that came to mind that may make a bit of sense, and I'm only using these because I think they're a little bit more well known.
Sure.
So, as a comparison of a lot of people have used like Salesforce and a lot of people have used like HubSpot. But some people use like HubSpot for more of marketing than for a CRM. Some
Right.
people do it for both. So the way I'm kind of like thinking about the way you're talking about stuff is you were saying Twitter into Feather, then Feather goes to something else, but it would not be where like Salesforce and HubSpot need to talk to each other and pass data back and forth. That would be a different data model.
So no, it can be the same. And so you can actually like pass data back and forth, but the trick is to kind of, instead of like it just being a circle where it's kind of happening all the time,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of think of it in like very specific steps. And so, in actuality, the system might perform these steps very, very quickly. Like it could be in the order of milliseconds, right? And even like as you're designing an API, you may go out to this system, get some information back. Based on that information, send another request and kind of go back and forth. But in terms of like modeling out the steps that you have to go through, this is a really good way to just kind of simplify the thinking about it, right? And so as you're deciding like what needs to happen, you can always combine that into steps that like again happen very quickly, but you don't need to think about it from like this whole like perspective of I've got to do all these things in like a single step. So it's really all
Okay.
about breaking out the steps into individual pieces that you can kind of understand as they flow through time, right? And so it's
Okay.
really about like ordering the steps and kind of figuring out which steps need to happen. Um, and so in data pipelines, a lot of times these are very discrete steps, whereas in designing like an application, they may be kind of combined together. But if you break them out in kind of that way of thinking, it's just a lot easier to reason about and a lot easier to kind of like hold in your mind, right? And that's one of the toughest parts of like software engineering, is you start to like develop these very complex data models, right? Because the world is a complex place. So the more you have to kind of hold in your mind at any one point in time, the harder it is. And so that's why I really like to just focus in on things like as fine-grained as possible in these steps. And so when I break it out into these like individual steps, I can then focus on like maybe it's just like a single method that I'm trying to implement, as opposed to holding the whole thing in mind. Because when you really do a good job of designing your data models and kind of how that data flows, you shouldn't have to worry about the rest of it, because it should be very tightly kind of controlled as to which part of the system you're affecting for any change. And that's really the biggest part to having scalable systems, because it gets tougher when you might have heard like leaky abstractions. That's something that kind of comes up, right? And so the abstraction is essentially the data model you're using. But the leaky abstraction is saying like, the model that you're using in kind of one specific area of the system, it is being exposed to other areas of the system that don't need to know about that, right? And so when you're kind of developing these various models, you want to make sure that essentially the part of the system that they're being used in are the only ones that know the inner workings of that model, because you want to be able to change it without affecting external parts, right? So it really comes into just being able to contain what happens in those models. And that's kind of the other aspect that I really like when it comes to these models, is making it to where different parts of the systems don't need to know the specifics of how that information gets to be there. It just needs to know that it's there or not, and probably like what format that goes into, right? And so this might be easier to kind of work with some realistic examples of just kind of how to model this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I was looking at is kind of figuring out how to set up a system that I could have people first of all, like, so yeah, let's talk about the goals of the system first, right?
Yeah, I'm just posting these in here because these are also resources individuals can use to look up more about data modeling,
Excellent.
because
Yes.
the way you explain them definitely do make sense. These are just like other snippets saying basically the same thing, just as resources. So, but you said first steps.
Yeah. So, kind of the first steps are to define, what you want a given system to do, and
Okay.
so, um,
I'm taking notes now.
this should be good, hopefully.
All right, all right. So we
Um,
got step one is
so let's see. So what I want to be able to do is I want to create a system that will allow people to schedule on my calendar. And so I probably want them to have a preference of either like pre-recorded or live streamed.
okay.
And so, that's not everybody is comfortable live streaming. It's a skill that you need to kind of develop, right? So some people might have a preference as to one or the other. And then, from there, I want the ideally it would create some sort of event, whether that be on Twitch or I use Riverside for kind of my streaming. So I don't know if any of this actually connects. I haven't looked at it yet. So this is all like just thinking out loud here. And let's see. So
I used to use Riverside, but it was so glitchy when I did, and it
really,
was like it was about 10 months ago.
okay.
So, just like any startup, it can scale very quickly and get help and make lots of changes. It was more of I was just so frustrated with it crashing. I lost interviews, that kind of stuff that I was like,
Oh wow. Yeah, no,
I
I
can't
could
do
definitely
this.
see
I
that.
can't do this.
I've only used it for a couple things so far, and it's worked out well for that. And I was actually really amazed at how nicely it streamed to both Twitter and Twitch. Like
Nice.
I didn't even realize that you really could stream from Twitter. There's a whole
Yeah.
like media thing. Like it's really hard to find, and the fact that I could
Yeah.
only find it through Riverside's documentation seemed a little weird, which considering I do a lot of work with like the Twitter APIs and everything, that was very
Was it
surprising.
difficult to set up with Riverside? Because
No.
because I used StreamYard, and that's the only reason I knew that Twitter live streamed.
Yeah, like it's super easy to set up. Like you just have to kind of connect it with kind of the streaming RTMP address or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the key, but it's like I didn't even know that like media center for Twitter even existed to like
Yeah.
be able to stream, which I feel like that would be better documented, but oh well.
That's okay. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just kind of we can kind of think here about what this model could look like, right? So kind of the first steps that I like to do is I like to identify the nouns. And that's kind of the easiest way to think about it. So the different objects that I care about in this system. And so, starting off, I can kind of see that there's a person, right? So somebody is doing the scheduling. There is going to be an event. Let's see.
Would
So,
we need to define calendar? And also, do you think we could do it from different calendars?
so we could, and so this is actually that's a great question. And so the one thing I would ask then is kind of like, what's a calendar? And I know it seems like a weird question, but the reason I ask that is because if you think of the difference between like a Google Calendar and like, Microsoft Calendar, Apple Calendar, whatever, right? Like they all kind of represent the same thing, but they're going to do it in different ways. And so this really comes down to this like baseline thinking of like, what is a calendar in terms of our system? So for that, I think a calendar makes sense. And we'll call a calendar a collection of events.
Okay, because this is one thing that I struggle with on Calendly. And if there's an update, anybody from Calendly watching, please let me know. But this also piqued my interest because I have my podcast calendar, then I have my Teach Jenn Tech calendar, and then I have my Gravity calendar. And I'm like, y'all, I can't keep up with all these calendars that I'm like, can we just like have something read to all of it, but also post to all of it? Where Calendly only posts to one.
It does. And so I'm trying to think because
I don't know if it's possible.
My calendar actually does. And I'm trying to think that I think it's clockwise. That actually, if you're like busy on one calendar, it blocks it off in the others. And the only reason I know that is because we started using it for work and then it popped up, which is handy. It's also kind of annoying because I get like 2 notifications every time it goes off, and it's like, hey, here's your actual event, and here's one that just says busy. Like, okay, well that's
I'm not gonna lie though, if that like makes it so that way people don't overschedule stuff, I'm kind of
that's exactly what it's good for, because it's like that way anytime I have something scheduled, like through my personal calendar, it also blocks it off on my work calendar, and so as long as nothing like blows up catastrophically, I'm able to kind of schedule things that overlap that way.
And it was called Clockwise?
Clockwise, yeah.
All right, I'm going to be looking that up after this. Thank you. Look
Yeah,
at
no
you
problem.
and your scalability.
Right.
That helps scaling.
It does, and that's actually a great a great point. Like as you start integrating different things in, like you start running into these kind of different collisions, right? And then it becomes a problem of like, well, how do I manage all of these? Which is, when you have kind of these data models and understanding like the actual ways that the kind of these different products can interact, you can see it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, which is why it's important to kind of simplify as much as possible.
When we have a chance, and yes, I'm being rude and looking on my phone.
No, you're fine.
I'm curious if this would be considered a data model because I almost feel like I may have gotten stuck on earlier this weekend trying to create a data model in like how I'm going to be posting stuff or how I'm going to like figure out scheduling, because it's like it's so confusing for me. And I mention this because I can see how data models are could only be considered for tech. Yet I think it's like really data models are this visualization that we need for so many other topics or things in life that
everything. Because it's a simplification, right? And that's kind of what it comes down to, being able to identify the parts that you care about. And yeah, this is exactly it. So it's
oh, too big. So basically what I was doing just to try to get it so people can get a visualization is I need to post content. We talked about this earlier. I have not enough time. Like I have a content scheduler. That's not my problem. It is literally visualizing what I need to create and how I'm going to create it. And for the most part, like Teach Jenn Tech, cool. That one was pretty figured out. That's the one in green. Gravity, cool. I can Google some stuff, figure it out, ask the team, post some stuff. API meetup, easy enough. That one's easy peasy. And like I posted this black graph is just like, okay, what platforms that I'm posting them on. What I was really stuck on, and I'm currently not doing yet, is after I record an episode, what do I do with the podcast? Because live streaming is pretty easy, but I'm so stuck on how to create that data model on the podcast. What do I do? How do I visualize this? How do I think through this? Because I don't know how to go to A to Z because it's too much for me. And I don't know if this is how you've ever started a data model or this is how a data model could be started. I am curious, like, do you have any visualizations like this that you've used before?
So a lot of times that this is exactly how data models come out, because it's like, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to solve this kind of like complicated problem, right? And there's a lot going on here. And so
Yes.
and like that's the reality of life right now. And so I think I actually really like the fact that you brought up that this isn't like just a tech problem, because one of the things that we realize is that tech is actually touching all aspects of our life now, right? And there's apps that like help us manage everything, and that just means we have a million apps that all like never talk to each other, and they're all a pain. And so I think one of the things we do need to get to is more individualized systems, and being able to kind of create our own things. And like Notion is actually a great way to do some of that, right? Because you can create a database, you can build automations off of that. And so in terms of looking at something like that, so I would say like, okay, so,
I can bring it back up. I didn't know if you wanted to still talk about it.
Yeah, we can. And so,
Here,
okay, so we've got some
wrong screen again.
Different things there, right? So we've got
this is probably the one that was the most complicated, was the podcast stuff.
Yeah. And so I think that would be a good thing to model, right? And so, a couple of the nouns that jump out. So we've got the podcast, right? And again, this seems simple because we're only going to talk about like this specific podcast. But the nice thing is, like, once you solve a problem for like one thing of yours, if you kind of think about how you solve it, you can see how like, oh, well, I could actually do this to support multiple podcasts or all of that. So I tend to think of it in like fairly general terms, even if it's like for a specific instance, just because I do like to constantly have like product ideas, and I've got a million product ideas, probably way too many, that are all planned out, and I've bought domains for half of them, but that's another
been there.
That's another problem.
That's actually a big reason why you and I talked about that. We're like, yeah, data models. I'm like, I don't know what that is. So yesterday, Anthony has been one of my mentors. He's AJC Dev, I think, on Twitter. I'll have to actually look it up. And he was like, yeah, you should watch these videos before you do data modeling. And it wasn't until we started talking about the calendar that you were talking about that I'm like, oh, wait, this is literally what I'm struggling with this last weekend, trying to figure out. And I'm like, mind blown. And just how we literally do this out, because none of this is technically like the tech side of things. I'm not trying to connect an API right now for a data model. I'm literally just trying to figure out the process I'm supposed to do stuff.
Well, and that's kind of the cool thing, because a lot of times I build out these, these DAGs, right? And you think about that in terms of like actually moving data through a system, but it's really like just thinking about the steps I take when I do things manually. And then I look for where can I automate, because I don't have to automate all the steps in the process. If I can figure out what the time consuming parts are that I don't like to do and just how to automate those, then I've gained a lot, right? And so we don't actually have to build out these super complex systems, but just mapping out kind of how different things like fit together, you start to see like, oh, well, this piece I do the same thing every time, so this would be a good thing I could learn how to automate, right? And so, a lot of times we think like, oh, this is just a complicated process, like I'll it's just going to take all of this time forever, when in reality we could spend a couple hours probably learning how to automate some like specific piece of it that then saves us 3 to 5 hours a week or a month, and it pays for itself over time. And then as you develop these like little like pieces, you start to connect them into more complex systems, right? So when you build out like a tiny system that does one thing well, then that is a node that you can add into a bigger system down the line. And that's really how all systems are developed, right? Like you start off with like, the kind of the MVP, right? Something that does like one thing and it does it every time you do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's repeatable. Because once you have things that are repeatable, then it's like you can move them around. You can do things in different orders. You can, do things like, kind of build once, publish multiple times, right? Like if you have like different places you want to go with it. And so that's really how things can start scaling. But in terms of this, we can, so, we kind of got the podcast, right? And so the podcast, if we look at like kind of specific attributes, right? So the podcast has like a name and a URL.
Yeah.
And then so, and then the podcast has episodes, right? So the episodes are going to have, probably like a title, a guest, maybe more than one guest. So that's something we want to think about. Like when you think about what is contained kind of within that noun and the different attributes it has, you want to kind of determine like, is this something it only has one of, or is it going to have, more than one? And so, for guests, I'd say, okay, we'll probably want to leave it open that it could potentially be more than one guest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so again, you're going to have a URL that'll go to that specific episode. And it'll have like a duration of some sort. So it'll be, some amount of time, which may or may not be important, but just kind of as we're thinking about it, that could potentially be important.
Would
Because
we
then
put description?
description would be good, right? And that's actually what I tend to struggle with my podcast, because I'm like, oh, I've got the episode back, like, and it's edited, and now I've got to post it. But if I post it, I have to write the description, which means now I've got to think about what I want to write in the description.
Yes.
So that's
yes.
that's something that I'm still trying to solve. But yeah, the description's good.
That's something that's like, and I was trying to think of it like you're thinking a lot of like pre stuff. And I will say Monday, I was using Monday before I was using Notion, and they did help quite a bit in automations, which was really helpful. Like if a guest submitted, then it could like send them an email to set up their calendar. So all I had to do was like move in one area instead of sending every single email, which that automation was great. Yet it was way too expensive and they only had a minimum of 3 users, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's where it gets to be a problem, is like it does get like a lot of the systems that are built for some of this like automation stuff, they're geared towards larger companies that have a budget for it. And so
that was going to be my next question.
One of the things that I really try to do is figure out how to do things as cheaply as possible. Because I believe that like more creators, especially starting out, are the ones that need the most help when it comes to automation and kind of creating these sustainable processes, right? Because it gets to be a ton, and then it's like, okay, well, great, like eventually, like if you stick to it long enough, you'll have like a big audience, you'll be monetized, you'll be able to afford to like pay people to like manage different aspects of this. But what do you do until you get there, right? And so that's really where automation can come in handy. And just kind of going through this process of like, figuring out which pieces you need to kind of automate, or which would be the best way to do it. That gives you a way to kind of find the cheapest possible option. Because a lot of times you can do a lot of this for free or very cheap. Actually, there is a service because like a lot of people like Zapier.
I was just thinking about Zapier. That's funny.
Yeah, and so that's what a lot of people use for automation, but it gets expensive, and that's one I actually don't pay for, because I think it's a little overpriced. It works well and it's simple. But the one that I like is actually, and I haven't used it as much as I would like, and I need to play around with it more, but it's cool because I can self-hosted instance of it. So I dropped it in a private chat. I don't seem to have.
Oh yeah.
So if you want to share that,
I'll share it. Thank you.
Yeah, N8N. I don't know how it's actually like pronounced, but it does a lot of the same thing that Zapier does, and it's excuse me, it's open source. You're able to self-host it for free. And so, like if it's only you using something like and just running it as a Docker image on your own system, like that's something pretty straightforward, and maybe not for everybody. Like I say, this is someone who's been in tech for a decade now or so. So I'm like, oh yeah, just put it on a Docker image.
And I think that's also something to call out of like I think like some of these things I'm like, okay, cool. Like especially I've been around tech for quite some time before I was started teach Jenn Tech. And I was like, cool, like I know about Monday, so I'll use Monday. I know I need to automate some of these things, but I don't know necessarily what I can and can't automate. So I love that we're going through this practice because I think that's something that I talk about this on my a neurodiversity mental health Twitter space that I host is that it just doesn't always connect the same way that it does for everyone. And I love that you're breaking it down and also like, hey, let's go through the nouns first to figure this out. And what can we automate? Because these are things that I'm just like, also, I had no idea how amazing this episode would be because like you're cool and everything, but I was like, I haven't met you much yet. I don't know what data models are. And I'm like, you're finally piecing it together.
That's the thing. And like, I'm always torn because it's like, I taught a cohort based course on called Supercharge Your Time. And I did one cohort of it last year. And it's like talking about the theory and like, the DAGs and everything are cool. And like, I'm really fascinated by kind of that aspect of it. But in reality, actually like doing it is the best way to kind of think about it. Because like you don't quite realize, but you really have like created a DAG in this little graph here.
What does DAG stand for again?
So it's a directed acyclic graph.
Okay.
And so I can drop the Wikipedia
please.
in the thing. But again, it's really like, it's just a like very basic model, but it's really about like steps moving through time, and that's really all it is. But it's just a really powerful like mental concept, because then like each of these steps here can actually then like be broken down into like a sub DAG, like and so if you think like each of these steps is kind of a like a simple like representation, but there's more to it, right? Like, so even listening to the episode, you can break down into the steps of like load the episode in the browser or whatever you're using, and branching off like take notes based on whatever, and so you can kind of get into these various different pieces. And so there's just a lot of really cool like math things that come into these directed acyclic graphs and things that you can count on. And so when companies do a lot of like big data stuff and a lot of like processing just astronomical amounts of data, these DAGs are good ways to ensure that various things are true about how that data moves through. And so it's just
it's interesting. This is fascinating. Not something I'm good at whatsoever. Like, I'm like, you want me to talk to somebody? I got you. I will. Like, I got that. You want me to get on stage? Again, I got you. But it's like this data stuff. I was seriously so stuck until my partner helped me write this out this weekend, asking me questions. And I'm like, oh, I forgot this, this, and this. And even now I'm like looking at it and I'm like, I don't know what I can automate. So I just love that you talk about how important it is to like not just hear it in theory, because the tangible is is so important.
Right. It is. And, you know, I think like people can probably go their entire life without hearing the word dag, unless they know me, and then they'll probably hear it more than once. But, you know, it's one of those like that's not really necessary. But it is good to like follow up if like that's something that you're interested in learning. And, you know, especially if you want to ever get into like data engineering, or kind of how those data pipelines are built. It's a super fundamental concept that is, you know, probably going to come up in like interviews and things, I would assume. So that's kind of good from that aspect of it. But yeah, so kind of getting back, I guess, into the model here. So, you know, we kind of talked about episodes last, and then kind of I see the clips, right? And so, you know, if we think about the noun of clip, so that's actually going to be, it's going to have a direct relationship. So it's part of a specific episode, right?
Yeah, like what am I going to put on TikTok as a video clip?
Right. And so that clip is going to be tied to a specific episode. So that's kind of, again, where we were looking at like, is this going to be one or many? So for a clip, it's going to be related to a single episode, most likely, unless you do a compilation. But a clip is
a specific episode. Yeah, okay. It's going to be one.
And so that's
just
kind of
so
where it's
far.
Like, okay, well, is this true? And that's
yes, it may be true in the future. That's a great question. Great point, actually. When we're building these, because this is another thing that I think I get stuck on, is I'm like, but what about this? Like, kind of like, is that going to be clips from multiple episodes? And then also, like, do I worry about that, which may make me take a few steps back because that is going to complicate things? Or do I do like, okay, like, yeah, maybe one day, but right now I just need to make my dag on what I'm doing right now because I haven't posted on social for 2 months. And should probably start doing that.
That's the thing. Like, it's good to think about how it might evolve, but also it's more important to know exactly how it is now. Okay. And this is something too that actually comes up in software engineering as you're like doing product requirements, because most people don't think about things in kind of these types of situations. And so you know, if you are like in a job interview or something, and somebody asks, you know, or says like, okay, well, here's the requirement. These are good things to ask about, because a lot of times, and I've had this experience where it's like, oh, well, you know, this particular record will have, you know, this type of value. And you're like, okay, well, is that ever empty? Well, nope, it's never empty. And then you like come to find out like, well, I mean, it's pretty much never empty. Like, but like maybe sometimes I guess it could be empty. Like, like those are very different things, right? Like, so really anytime you're looking at like words like always or never, those are good places to like dig in and be like, are we sure about that? Like,
yeah,
are we actually sure that that's always going to be the case, or that's never going to be the case? Because that's almost never true.
Yeah.
And so it's you know, that's a good place to think. But in terms of like this, yeah, it's like, okay, so what I would say is like, okay, so we'll say clip is tied to a specific episode, and then potentially we could have like a compilation, which is a collection of clips, right? And so that would be a good way to kind of branch that out. And so, you know, the clip is also going to have like a duration. It'll have some sort of location, whether it be like either a URL or just like a local file system location, right? And so, okay, that's probably pretty good for that. And then so the export is interesting. So,
that is supposed to be descript. Description is descript. Yeah, because I was like, I ran out of room.
No, I got it. I was like,
cool.
Okay.
Export takes forever because I'm exporting the videos after I edit them. So that's why I'm like, I need to start really registering that export is gonna take me forever.
Right. And so like that's something that you could always look at either automating or batching. Batching is kind of another good way. so a good, like, as you're kind of going through this, that's another thing that you can kind of identify, like, oh, if I can't automate it, I could batch it to where, like, okay, well, now I've got all of these things edited or whatever, and instead of just trying to, like, export one of them as I go through the process, well, now I can actually just export a whole bunch of these clips or whatever, right? And so export is a verb there. So a verb is a good time to look at, like, okay, well, that's kind of that's the arrows in the DAG, right? And so if the if you kind of think about, like, the nodes, the circles in the graph as nouns, the arrows are the verbs. And so that's something that would potentially be good. And so you could even, like, one of the things that I like to do as well, you're like, because what the tricky thing is, like, anytime you're getting into, like, automation is great as long as it works, but then what happens if it doesn't? And so one thing to kind of keep in mind is, like, okay, how easy is it to recover from failure? And so the first thing you've got to think about is, like, am I going to know that it failed? And so as I, like, do action, so in this case, like, as I'm exporting, if I did have that automated, like, I would probably either have some sort of, like, record created or some sort of notification that just said, like, hey, this happened, so that if it didn't come through, I would at least know that, like, something's broken and I've got to go look. And that's something, like, a Zapier's pretty good about, because that's kind of their business model. But if you are building stuff out yourself, that's something you want to pay attention to, because otherwise you'll get down the road and be like, oh, this thing that I thought was running for the last 3 months never actually ran.
That actually happened with my automations with Monday. I wouldn't know that people aren't getting the email.
Right.
Because, like, I mean, they were my fault. It wasn't like it was Monday's fault, in the fact that, like, I needed to change my Gmail password, that I didn't get a notification to update my password. So the connection lost and nobody was getting my emails.
Right. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind as you're going through. Just, like, are there notifications in place that either, like, it's notifying me that it happened, so that I know if I don't get a notification, it didn't happen, or at least needs checked? Or am I notifying in case of an error? Just some way to kind of be aware. And then let's see. So we've got kind of the description here, and we mentioned that in the kind of tied into the episode. But if we wanted to make that its own now, is that topics? I can't quite see what that is beneath description there.
Graphics. I need
graphics. Okay, there we go.
Like, I'll need the description to make the graphics.
Okay.
I think that's where I don't know where that, or it could be that I need descriptions for the clips, and then after I edit them, I need to make the description and the graphics. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's where my mind was at.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so that's something to kind of keep in mind too, right? So, a graphic is another potential noun there. And so one of the things that kind of, I think, might matter there is the destination. So, like, where is this graphic intended for? Because that might inform the size, right? That's something that
exactly.
It is kind of ridiculous. Like, you start talking through this and you're like, this is actually really complicated, isn't it?
It is. And people are like when they think about content creation. So, y'all, I get, like, I'm surprised. We actually don't have very many people here today, but I'm just like, yay, I get to ask all my questions. But, like, content creation is freakishly complicated. Like, having to go through all of these steps, and, like, there's I've been seeing quite a few articles and stuff about, oh, you don't need to make new content, use one piece of content 10 ways. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I still have to go through all of this
to
do that.
Yeah. Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
And actually, one of my famous things is, like, oh, I'll just go back and do all those other steps later. I never do. But
that is true. I was like, this was the one goal this weekend. It just didn't happen because for me, it's like so overwhelming that I'm like, but the podcast is so important to me that I'm like, cool, I need to figure out how to make this work. But I love that we're talking about it now because this isn't just me. This isn't just a me issue, like this is something that people really struggle with conceptualizing and doing.
Right. And I think it is, I think it's the reason that a lot of the content is ending up to be very much the same as well, right? Because the one of the easiest ways to kind of streamline this is to have, so-called best practices, or like templates, right? And so we do tend to look for like the shortcuts that we have in terms of like, okay, well, if I just follow this pattern, that'll be good enough. And so the problem is when everybody's doing that over and over, we get this kind of convergence on the same type of content because we're following the best practices that algorithms are rewarding. And like on YouTube, for example, that's a good one. If you look at like the top YouTube creators, all of their videos follow like very similar formats because that's what performs well according to the algorithm. And so there's a lot of work that goes into kind of feeding the algorithm, if you will. And like Mr. Beast did a whole bunch, like I saw him talking about the fact that he spent a ton of time like figuring out exactly what the algorithm rewarded and like doubling down on that content creation. And so it's like, people see, you got to be a YouTuber, like you just make videos. Like, no, it's actually way more than that. And there's research that goes into it, and in terms of like all of that, and that's what I think we need to kind of get away from. Which I think people being able to build these kind of systems themselves to make the annoying stuff sustainable so they can focus on like the creative aspects of it, I think is going to like be really beneficial in the long run because it's, that's kind of the part that matters, right? Like it's not the, the thumbnail with like the surprised face, like pointing to the description or whatever. I don't watch.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I also want to like point out is like edit. I know how to edit because I interned somewhere. It's not my favorite thing. Definitely not something that I love to do. But I know, okay, cool. This is my intro. I already have that done. This is my outro. I have that done. I just need to make sure the audio is good and export, But there's a lot that goes into the steps of editing. And like we could be breaking that down even more. I don't want to, but like that's when people talk about getting into content creation now, I'm like, do it. Just know that it is a process. It is a process.
And that's exactly it. And it's one of those you don't really like. I've done all sorts of things and I figured out what I like and what I don't like. And like the podcast now that I've got is like actually my third attempt at a podcast. So the first one, there was like one episode published on YouTube. The second one, I recorded a couple interviews that never actually got published because of the editing part. Right. And so now I actually just have Lobo edit my podcast. He's like, I'll edit them for you. He's like, just send them to me and I'll send them back. And it's not, again, like it doesn't need to be like super edited. All it needs is like, just go through and like, probably like chop off the junk at like the beginning and the end. And it's all about the conversation. So like, I don't have like an intro or an outro because I don't want to complicate it. And I just wanted it to get to the point where I could publish it as easily as possible.
Right.
And so I think as new creators, that is the thing to get to. And like Lobo always laughs at me because I'm like, he'll like ask me for advice and I'm like, just publish it. Like, just post it. Just post it because that's the hardest thing to get over. Like, even like, he's decently established at this point, but he's like, oh, do I do this? Do I do that? And like, just post it. Like, if you have a hunch, go for it. Maybe it's right. Maybe it's wrong. But the hardest part of content creation is putting yourself out there. And like, it's really easy to pursue perfection and like have the perfect process to get there. But the most important thing is really like just putting yourself out there some way because it's an iterative process, right? Like it gets better over time. This process develops over time as you do things over and over. You start to see the things that you're repeating, right?
And on that point, that's such a great point is um so for example, and I want to say that about Teach Jenn Tech. I actually just posted an article yesterday about this is I failed my way into becoming a developcado is what I'm calling myself because devrels are avocados. Like it's a thing. Y'all, it's a thing. My other article will show you why it's a thing. But failing my way to Devocado. Like I failed so many times. Teach Jenn Tech is my third show. So greater than podcast. It did survive, but we had an intern that did the audio and I met him at a coffee shop. Like it was so random. And this was back in like 2016. And then my second show is Shit You Don't Want to Talk About. It is still out there, yet this is the stuff I'm struggling with. What we're going through right now is where I'm like, I don't know if I can keep the podcast because it's like, it's not going to be organic. Where like Teach Jenn Tech is very, very organic because people are interested in learning tech. Like
Right.
it's easier. It's a lot easier to talk about. It's a lot easier to comprehend. It's a lot easier than mental health and all that shit. So it's like, how do we really work on making it accessible when we don't know what we don't know yet?
And that's, I think the I kind of realized the one thing I didn't actually talk about is I'm also writing a book now.
Oh, yay.
And so this came out like I say came out, like the idea, I decided to just like announce it last week and do it. And it's called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Future.
Oh, I like it.
Because it's, kind of the play off of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is one of my favorite books of all time. But also one of the things that I'm fascinated with is kind of the evolution of technology and where it's going. And I do think the future is going to look drastically different, based, in terms of like future of work, future of education, all of that, because of a number of different factors. But essentially, the skills that are really going to be valuable in the future are not necessarily what people think they are today. And, I think learning tech, a lot of people get into tech because it pays better, right? And I do think that that's going to be not as true in the future as it currently is. I think tech roles are overvalued right now, and as an engineer, like I'm probably pissing off a lot of engineers who are like by saying that, but the reality is like engineers are paid well because of the fact that we have to learn constantly, right? Everything is constantly evolving rapidly, and we need to kind of keep up on latest trends. You've got I've used different programming languages throughout my career, different frameworks, different and it's still hard to pick up at times, like, because everything is just like, it's evolving so fast.
Right.
But the thing that people don't realize is that's not just true for engineers. You look at like product managers and designers and all of these other roles, software is evolving there too. And companies aren't great at rewarding efficiency right now. And so they actually tend to punish efficiency, which is a whole nother thing. But it's going to result in a lot of people like burning out and just deciding to do their own thing. And I think one of the things that's super cool about where the future is going is even if you end up not in tech, just understanding how tech works and doing things like thinking through this to create like basic automations with Notion, right? And kind of figuring out these steps, that's going to be incredibly valuable, because then, you don't need to build the next app that gets 1 billion downloads. If you can build a small system that saves 10, 15 hours a week based on your daily job and like opens up that time to do things that you care about, like that's going to be what changes your life, right? Because, and then, you start thinking about how you can, start like outsourcing your systems to some extent and being able to like give people the blueprints. And you kind of see that now with people selling like Notion templates and things like that. But just understanding kind of where the future is going, a lot of what I'm playing around with in this book is like, okay, well, here's kind of, I'm breaking it down to like, here's the past technology that kind of like was started. And then I'm going to be doing a bit with like, here's where we're currently at. And then finishing it up with like, and here's kind of where things are headed and why I'm seeing these trends. And it's going to be like, it can be overwhelming because there's so many options, but the real key is like finding out what works the best for you and like just rolling with that. Like you don't actually need to pay attention to everything.
Right.
You need to find what works and then just go with it. Find what you enjoy, because that's really going to be what's sustainable in the long run. And then, you build out these systems and then you kind of just like do your own thing. And you kind of have that level of freedom that people are really struggling with right now, because they're just getting worked and, harder and harder. And it's, you get quiet quitting, which no, they're just underpaid because they're forced to learn at the same rate as engineers and they're not getting paid the same.
Yes. Something you mentioned though is about trying things on and seeing if they fit. It kind of is a way of paraphrasing it. And that's something we talk about with mental health so often, because tools and techniques that help me may not help the next person and vice versa. Like there's some really cool tools out there that I'm just like, don't work for me whatsoever. And again, it's like creating this data model and like things of, okay, cool. I feel like people may interchangeably use like creating mental or like data models to, I also have that in my toolbox, when in reality, we're creating data models about that too.
Right. We totally are. And it's like we represent everything kind of in our minds with these data models. We don't call them data models. Sometimes they're called mental models. A lot of times they just like the noun that we have in our head, and there's some abstract model behind that. Right. And so it's not defined. And so creating like these data models is really the process of like defining this. And it is really powerful when you start to go through and like actually try to define the things that you're thinking about, as opposed to just like this abstract word, because people define things very, very differently. And so, one of the things that I've learned is really not to assume that two people mean the same thing with the same word, because they're almost never exactly the same.
It's so true.
And so, the kind of cool thing about a data model is it's like, in that kind of API contract, it's like, here's the data model and this is exactly what it is. And if you want to talk to me, like, here's the model you need to understand that this is using. And so it is really good to think about things in that concrete of terms, because it is very different from the way we usually interact. And when you start to realize that, people's models are different, and that's why they can't, connect on certain things, you really start to think about it and like, okay, well, how can we get from like one model to the other? And that's kind of where, in like data, it's like, data transformations. And like I talked about, going from like Twitter to Feather, we have kind of the same idea of things, but those are actually like different representations. So how do we make one turn into the other? And so that's the idea of like transformation of data. And I think it's actually really handy in like talking with other people too. And like, you start to realize like, oh, we need to like get more understanding as to like what we actually mean when we use these words. So those are really good skills to have. Like,
I was just about to say, I think, and I took down the share screen because I think something that would be really cool is to have you on the show again, first off.
Absolutely.
But to like take something like this, this is a little easier for me to conceptualize because it's where I'm stuck on, instead of like your project. I was totally down for your project till I was like, oh wait, I'm actually working on that myself and it's not clicking. Damn.
No, see, that's great, because it is like, as I said, this was a kind of a new, like, okay, I'm trying to figure this out. And it actually comes into the whole book writing process too, because I want to like create some like inbound interviews and things like that, and then actually gamify it a bit
That'd
but
be cool.
that's another like
That's story for
I'm
another
having
time.
fun with it, right?
Well, what I'm wondering if we can do next time is, so I have this like out, this photo. It's done. I've created the
Yeah.
best I could come up with. And I think it would be cool if we can do it on like a Miro board or something, because I'm pretty sure my notes don't look anything like your notes.
Right.
In the fact of like, how to make these dags. And I'm just like trying to keep up and those type of things, that I think it would be really cool to take and really showcase how we may go from like an info dump of here's all the steps I have to do, to then where do I go with this? Because I don't know what I necessarily could automate. Like I have a template for graphics, but I still need to export those. I still need to add any audiograms. I still need to, like, I think it would be really, really cool to showcase how you go from one to another in a technical standpoint, but then also just for people that don't naturally know how to go from A to Z, because that's 100% me. I'm like,
It's not a natural thing, because again, like we're taught to kind of create these abstract models, and we figure out the process along the way, but we typically don't do a ton of like thinking about the process. And that's something that like actually going through the exercise of modeling these things really helps you do, because it takes practice, and I don't think there are very many people who can just kind of do it naturally.
mhm,
But as you do it, you gain experience. Usually you start using them and then
mhm.
realize what you're missing. And then so in the future, you're like, this is what I always miss, because it's something that like doesn't come to mind right away. And so, yeah, experience is absolutely valuable there. So I'd be happy to kind of come again, and we can walk through the actual process of it, and start outlining exactly like how to do it, and potentially even like automate some of it, just to see like what's
That'd
possible.
be dope
And
too, because this is a kerfuffle, a hot mess of, I don't know, I can do it, but it's an organization that I think that's what I always referred to it as, is I just need to figure out how to organize it. But I don't think it was necessarily organizing. It was the data model, which is kind of organizing, but not.
it is. It's breaking it down into like very concrete representations of what's happening, and that's essentially, if you can kind of figure out how to like represent it, the actual process of automating it becomes a lot easier. And that's kind of when I was talking in the beginning about creating these scalable systems that work, like if you define it well, it becomes easy, and that's really what you should be looking for. And if something is hard, you probably don't have it defined well, because a well-defined data
Mm,
model, when you really want to like automate something, ideally you have it down to a Google search that you can like type in, and it's like, here's a step-by-step process of how to do this thing you just searched for. And so that's kind of the end goal that we're trying to get it to, right? We want it to be simple enough to Google search for how to automate this, and it'll just pop up. And then obviously with some things that's not quite reality, but it's true for more than you would imagine.
what up, homie? And we went through so much today. Homie, how long have you been hanging out with us? Were you here the entire time? Because if so, like, my brain kind of hurts, but I'm really excited for like Leo coming back on the show, because this is, it's definitely something that oh, sorry, I just like glanced over at my notes and I'm like, what's TT video clips? TikTok, TikTok, TikTok video clips. I think it's definitely something that breaking it down and seeing would be so good. Oh, you've been lurking. I agree. We need to have Leo back. Leo, you are amazing. And thank
This was
you
fun.
again for joining, because I love how data modeling really does show up. I'm like on repeat right now. I'm like, it just shows up everywhere.
It
And
does, and that's like it's hard to like create something like, okay, well, here's how you model data. Like, and you know, I again, I kind of like tried to prepare, and I'm like thinking like different things, and like we talk about, but it's like it really is just everywhere, and like you've got to chat about it, and eventually you start to see it, and then you practice it, and it eventually comes out. Like it's chiseling away at the marble until it creates a sculpture, right?
And that's what matters. And when we get off the live stream, we can figure out when. And I do have to say, really quick, because you're here, homie. Homie was my first subscriber.
Excellent. How cool.
I'm so excited. I am up to 2 now. I am very excited. And it's growing, it's learning, and learning live is hard. It's like
it is.
I'm gonna make mistakes in front of everybody, and I'm gonna.
No, but I think you're doing great, and that's part of like the, again, kind of going back to the build in public university. A lot of it's learning in public, and so being able to do that, I think, actually sets you up very well for success, because it's that proof of work, right? Instead of being on a resume, like you're like, oh, like just here's my live stream that I've been doing, that like literally we're going through all these different topics and chatting about them. And you know, it creates this level of proof that you can't quite capture on like a resume or anything. And plus you just actually go do stuff with it, right? Like you're actually like, oh, well, now I've got, you know, this like distribution channel, and I've got these podcasts, and like you can start tying things together. And that's really like where I get excited about, like, as things like start growing, and then I can like start connecting them, and like there's all these little overlaps that kind of come into play. And building out, you know, these individualized systems that help us do whatever we want to do, even if it's like all this weird stuff, and just, you know, but it's fun, and that's the part that's real fun. That's what matters.
And Steph, their Twitter is Steph Like Curry, is also looking at being on the show, and they are a data engineer too.
Awesome.
It was the first one that I registered was a data engineer, but I think that's because of Twitter Spaces and stuff. And thanks, homie. I appreciate it. Saying, no doubt, get to witness a rising star. I kind of want like a star that I can just like start holding up. It'd be fine.
Every episode, hold it up a little higher.
Well, I just did the journeys of a developcado. And so my boss was like, can you just have an avocado just slowly sprouting on each of them, on each of the blog posts? And we looked up what an avocado plant looks like. It has really weird flowers, so I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a little sad. But anyway, you and I will, once we end this broadcast, we will figure out when to schedule next. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Hit us up if you have questions on Twitter. My Twitter is right there, and Leo's Twitter is there-ish. Something like that. So let us know. I appreciate you. And follow. There we go. Follow. Unless you're watching on YouTube, then you can like it and subscribe and all that. Thank you. Talk soon.
Thanks, homie.